Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight to our Arkansas Valley Audubon Society program. My name is Aaron Ramirez. I'm the manager of local history and genealogy. And unfortunately, Peg Rooney is not with us tonight, but I'm very happy to introduce Trent DElahenty, private lands wildlife biologist at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. Hello, Trent. How are you doing? I'm going to unmute you. Well, no, I can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself.
Hello, yes, my name is Trent DElahenty. I'm with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. I started this job in October of 2020 and have been working with private lands since then in multiple counties. I will start my presentation and I'll have some more information about it. So, like I said, my name is Trent DElahenty. I'm a private lands biologist. I work for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies with a partnership with the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's a subsidiary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I cover a pretty extensive area, so I cover Crowley, Otero, Pueblo, Huerfano, and Los Animas counties, and occasionally go up to Lincoln County. Here's a little about Bird Conservancy as a whole. So our mission is to conserve birds and their habitat through science, education, and stewardship. So our science team does quite a bit of bird counts. They put up MODIS towers. We have an education team that hold youth camps and outreach events. And then there's my team, the stewardship team, which focuses on private lands conservation to promote bird habitat on private lands. So how do we define habitat? So habitat is the combination of food, water, and shelter and space that wildlife need to meet their needs. Many of these grassland species will eat various insects, seeds, small mammals. It kind of depends on the year and what they're kind of adapted to consume. So water is found in streams, playa lakes, reservoirs, stock ponds for cattle, and through vegetation and insects. We live in close to, some years it is classified as a desert, not always classified as a desert. So it's pretty dry out here. So these birds get water wherever they can. A lot of times that is through vegetation and through their insect intake. So a shelter, it's not all created equal. And some birds, like this photo that I have here, is excellent pheasant or quail habitat. So it's very thick, lots of cover. So some of these birds prefer these tall bunch grasses, and other birds prefer very short grass and sometimes little to no grass if there's something like a killdeer or a mountain plover. But many of these birds just require like what I like to call a mosaic of different habitat requirements and different sorts of grass stands, and sometimes they like to feed in crop fields and then spend some time in there's some of the rangeland, and then like to go into thicker cover during the night or go out into more open cover during the night. It all kind of depends on the bird and what they're kind of adapted to do. So yeah, some of these birds can survive very small little pockets. So you can find, high concentrations of birds around a marsh, like red-winged blackbirds, for example. You can be out on a trail in the middle of Denver and just a small little wetland seep, and you'll find tons of red-winged blackbirds. And then there are other birds, such as the lesser prairie chicken, that if there's a structure within a quarter mile, they're not even going to be in that area. So different bird species require different amounts of space to really thrive. So the shortgrass prairie is a disturbance-driven ecosystem. So fire and grazing are very important ecological drivers within these systems. So I have a picture up here. This is from the fire that burned near Bent's Fort earlier this spring. And then I got a photo of some cattle. So much of the previous year's growth is stored above the soil in these plants. So you go into a lot, even so if we're looking at this picture up here of the fire, you can see a lot of that standing dead grass from last year. So a lot of this growth and nutrients are actually still stored above the soil. So when we're burning, or if cattle are grazing and passing it through and then putting it back into the soil, we're returning those nutrients to the soil to allow for future growth. So many of our native species are adapted to fire and grazing pressure and actually thrive in those sorts of conditions. And it is estimated anywhere from 30 to 60 million bison graze the plains before westward expansion. So, and we've kind of replaced that with now 40 million or so cows. That's a really rough estimate, but it's kind of somewhere in the middle. So we're kind of transitioned from those bison into these cattle now, and our cattle are our main disturbance driver. So this grazing pressure provides heterogeneity on the landscape, so it provides different sorts of habitat, and it's used to mimic this grazing pressure the bison had. But in areas like where we live in the plains here, which can be unbelievably dry on our drought years, fire is very suppressed, and is something that is great ecologically, but there's a lot of I guess liability on whoever would start a fire. Like you look at some of those fires in New Mexico that got started, and where that started, there can be a big liability. So folks are kind of shying away from doing the prescribed fires, and we're looking to do more of grazing for our grass management, which is a very viable tool. So as we look at grasses and forbs as habitat components, using this grazing management as a tool can provide a variety of outcomes. So I really like this diagram. I don't remember who made it. I think it might be the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative, but I'm not sure. But it shows the amount of grazing level, and then below there is where that would drive the vegetation to, and then the different species that use this. So every once in a while, you'll drive past a field or something, and you'll be like, wow, that was grazed really hard. There's hardly any grass out there. But, species such as mountain plover, thick-billed longspur actually prefer that. This photo down here is actually of a mountain plover nest in Chico Basin Ranch from last year, I believe, on a grazed prairie dog town. There was hardly any cover, and that's where the mountain plovers were nesting. And then we have on the flip side, this is on the bottom right, this is very low grazing activity, and it's starting to kind of turn into more of a sand sagey shrubby habitat that would be good for a species like curlews and lesser prairie chickens. So our grazing management can be based on target species. I know there are landowners in Lincoln County that are managing for their mountain plovers because of the imperiledness of those birds. So they're actively managing for them in that way. And then in areas like Baca County, they might be holding back the cows a little bit and grazing less intensively to promote that thicker, more mixed shrub cover and the sand sage cover that a prairie chicken may need. So different management strategies. Not all grass is created equal. So when we look at the landscape, there's a varying amount of habitat or a varying amount of heights of grasses and things that can provide different habitat for different species. So some of the keystone species of the plains. So a keystone species is an organism that drives an entire ecosystem. So bison were the primary ungulate grazers of the plains, and now we use cattle to mimic their impacts. So when we're talking about what is driving the habitat out here, I mean, primarily in most of the circumstances of grasslands in the Eastern Plains. It is cattle or goats or some sort of livestock or grazing animals. Prairie dogs are also a driver of change on the landscape, and they provide their burrows and shorter vegetation that provide habitat for many different species, like the burrowing owl, black-footed ferrets, mountain plovers like to nest, like I was saying before, on these kinds of areas. And just critters out and about that are looking for some cover, and they find an old abandoned prairie dog burrow. It seems to kind of you find things that you wouldn't expect in a prairie dog town in prairie dog towns sometimes, through my experience. So the fight for conservation. So habitat loss is something that is a very big buzzword these days, and it is happening. So we're losing habitat through residential development, shrub and tree encroachment, row crop conversion, energy development, poorly managed grazing, climate change, and economic shifts in some of these rural communities. So we've seen a 53% reduction in grassland bird population since 1970. But there is hope, so don't get too down on those past two statements I just presented you. So our knowledge of land stewardship and ethics is growing. Research is happening constantly, whether that be social research or scientific research, or social sciences is a science, but there's just a lot of research going into this as far as private lands, public lands, just overall land conservation as we're seeing habitat loss. So our knowledge is expanding. Farmers and ranchers are finding ways to incorporate wildlife into these places and make, share the land with the wildlife. Some of this can be through just managing their grazing, or having different hunting leases and certain things like that, which is actually actively promoting bringing that resource onto their property and trying to make it part of what their overarching goals are on their property. So progressive grazing strategies are becoming more common. I've been looking into this virtual fencing, which is a relatively new thing where we're putting electronic GPS collars on cattle. They're kind of these shock collars where these ranchers can draw different pastures, and within 24 hours, their cattle will start following these new boundaries. So we have areas that need more grazing, and we need to keep off of a certain area. So, we have a stream running through, and we don't want to ruin that riparian habitat. A landowner can pull up a tablet or a phone and actually draw a line around that and keep the cattle out of there. So it's a budding technology. It still has a little ways to go, but just progressive grazing strategies like rotational grazing, high intensity, short interval grazing, which is a lot of cows on one place for a short amount of time and then giving it a long rest, which we're seeing very good results as far as habitat quality in those areas. We have programs such as easements and CRP. I'll talk about CRP a little more so later, that are actively protecting against development. We have partner programs. Government bodies and private landowners are fighting shrub and tree encroachment at a large scale. I'll talk about that a little more later. It's not quite as big of an issue in the western part of the Eastern Plains, where we're getting lower precipitation. The reality is it's hard enough for us to establish trees out here. We don't have really the moisture to support these. The commons are red cedars, but we do have some of these junipers making their ways down the foothills and out into our prairies, which is becoming an issue in some areas. So it is an issue in our areas, but not quite as bad as they're getting it in western, central and western Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma, where this red cedar encroachment is turning native grasslands into more of that mixed shrub, almost into forested habitat, which is taking away from our grassland birds. So, and farmers and ranchers are our private land stewards, are making a big impact on the overall health of an ecosystem. So they are our partners in conservation. These are our active land managers, and you'd be surprised at some of these rough, gruff landowners that I meet in the field some days that their hearts melt when they see a burrowing owl. So it's, like, they all have a soft spot. I mean, there's a reason they're working the land, is because they also love the land and they enjoy the wildlife and things they're seeing. So they are our partners in these, and we're working with them to promote bird habitat. So now coming kind of full circle back to my position. So we're promoting conservation on private lands throughout the Rocky Plains, or through the Rocky Mountains. So here's a map of our roster of private lands biologists. You can see we have quite a few in Colorado, and then a few in South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, and down into New Mexico. I'm based out of the Rocky Ford office. We actually have 2 biologists there. I'm not sure how well you all can see, but on this hash, these hash lines are CRP positions. So that is actually my position. I'm kind of a specialist working with that program in particular, which I will talk about a little more and explain. But we have another biologist in my office named Katie Merriweather, who is kind of our generalist and works on all sorts. We both work on all sorts of projects, but I kind of have more of a focus on one of these kind of programs. So Bird Conservancy and employs and delivers conservation with partnerships with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, as I was talking about before, which is a subsidiary of the USDA. And then our state agencies or grant partners that help to fund our position. So I work for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, but part of my funding comes from Bird Conservancy, part comes from the NRCS, and then part comes from some grant funding that we received. Some of our other biologists are partnered through the state and receive funding for their positions through there. So my work is primarily east of Interstate 25 with private ranchers. I do have a couple of projects I'm working on west of Interstate 25 in Huerfano and Los Animas counties, but the majority of my work is going on out in the Eastern Plains. So many of these projects are funded through the Farm Bill, which I think I'll talk about on the next slide. Our priority species include the lesser prairie chicken, which is near and dear to my heart, mountain plover, bob white quail, burrowing owl, cassin sparrow, and many others. What we're doing, promoting grassland habitat is more of a guild. So a guild is a species that is, we may be targeting one species, but the effects of helping that one species is going to help just a cascade of many other species. So the Natural Resources Conservation Service, like I said earlier, it's a subsidiary of the Department of Agriculture. They conduct natural, they do conservation-based projects using the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is voted on every 5 years and passed through Congress, and it's a major source of conservation funding in the United States. I cannot emphasize that enough. The Farm Bill, not only is it helping our farmers and ranchers, but it's also providing tons of opportunities and programs and funding to promote conservation-based practices and projects. So the NRCS has multiple programs that support these conservation efforts on these private lands. One thing that happens within my line of work is we have tons and tons and tons of acronyms. So I have a few of them down here. So the EQIP is the first one. That's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. That program is a pretty competitive program, but farmers or ranchers will put in for funding to kind of cost share on some projects that will not only help their operation and what they're doing, but also kind of transition them to using more conservation-based practices. So we might cost share a new stock tank for them, but and a couple of interior fences for them to implement a rotational grazing system on a, might be a 2,000 acre pasture that had just been continuously grazed. So we can start kind of rebuilding that grassland component by giving some areas some more rest and moving cattle through there. Our conservation stewardship program, that's CSP, that program is kind of, they like to call it the above and beyond. So some of these landowners that work through EQIP, they might have done a project through there, and then they move on to this stewardship program where they're working with us to keep following a grazing plan and monitoring their grasslands for wildlife, and doing some more of this these practices that are more management based rather than us putting in some structures. It's more of them implementing more of these management decisions that are going to have lasting effects on their land. And then CRP and CRP Grasslands. So CRP is Conservation Reserve Program, and is a program that I'm very heavily involved with, and I'll get into it a little more here. So here's a great picture of a Conservation Reserve Program field on the right side that have, these are actually brooding prairie chicken chicks using that habitat. So Conservation Reserve Program is also known as CRP, and it's one of the largest conservation initiatives in the United States. This program pays farmers to cover highly erodible agricultural fields that were have very low production. So that might be they don't have irrigation rights, or the soil there is just not able to produce viable crops as on average years or below average rain years. So it's kind of taking those out of production, covering them with native vegetation to hold the soil in place. And this has made a huge impact on our grasslands. It's taking some of these prime kind of areas and putting them back into the grass. So about 20 million acres in the United States are enrolled in this program. This is kind of a coast-to-coast program. Some areas, like I'm originally from Wisconsin, my family has some CRP land, and it's actually to provide buffers for wetland or for along one of our river banks. So different CRP has kind of different focuses, but out here it's primarily just to try to keep soil on the ground and try to kind of provide some of that habitat. This was kind of originally kind of formulated through the effects we saw through the Dust Bowl throughout the years. So nearly 2 million of those 20 million acres are in Colorado. Extreme southeast Colorado was one of the hardest areas hit by the Dust Bowl in the past. So there's a lot of these fields that probably shouldn't have been turned over out of their native grass in the first place. And now we're getting them back into native grass species, and the wildlife are just drawn to these areas. So the benefits of CRP. This here is one of my favorite pictures I have of CRP. So these are old seeders and agriculture equipment that are retired at the end of a CRP field. So it kind of shows what was originally used to break this grass into crop production and is now covered by native grass, kind of what was once originally out there. So habitat begins at the soil, and CRP is keeping that soil from eroding. I'm a very big believer in soil health is going to lead to habitat health. If you're poorly managing your soil, you're probably poorly managing your habitat. Having good soil and kind of developing good soil is going to provide the nutrients that grasses and forbs and our native vegetation need to grow and thrive. And in return, our grassland species need to grow and thrive. So many of these CRP mixes contain some of these species that have been lost in much of the native rangeland. So before we were starting to do all these rotational grazing systems, there might have been some fields that were used. This is my winter pasture. This was my summer pasture. And if you're grazing during the same time, the same period every single year, some of these species are adapted to grazing pressure, but when it's continuously at the same time year after year, more adaptive plants to more of that higher intensive grazing are going to start coming in and crowding them out. So some of these species that we're seeing in these CRP mixes aren't really found in much of our native range. You can find them if you look hard, but they're not as widespread and as dispersed as they once were. So the CRP has limited disturbance. So in these contracts, they have what is called a mid-contract management. So once throughout that 10 years that piece of property is enrolled in this program, it needs to be either grazed, mowed, hayed. It needs to have some sort of disturbance to kind of reinvigorate some of that grass. And I cannot emphasize that enough, that we need disturbance on these fields. Otherwise, some of these CRP fields can start having a lot of that dead standing litter growing year after year after year. And that dead standing growth is actually almost choking out the new growth that's trying to grow underneath. So we do need some disturbance, but these fields having such limited disturbance compared to current or pieces of property that are actively a part of a farm or ranch management system can lead to some great things. So having a field that hasn't been grazed in 3 years can leave lots and lots of standing dead thatchy grass, which can provide excellent ground nesting habitat for birds. Most of our birds out in the plains here are nesting on the ground because, as you can see in this picture, there are no trees. You might have something like a burrowing owl that's nesting actually underneath the ground, but most of them are nesting in kind of these thicker pockets of ground. Some of them like the open. Like we were saying before, not all grass is created equal, but these birds really like to be able to have, a lot of these birds like this thick CRP that has a lot of standing dead from the year before, for them to, burrow down underneath and start laying some eggs and having some thick cover to hide from those coyotes or ferruginous hawks. So, and these patches of habitat provide a very valuable, what I like to call a mosaic on the landscape. So we have not every single piece of property within the Eastern Plains should be in CRP. Birds need varying habitats, and if we have everything that's overgrown and thatchy, we're going to be choking out those mountain plovers. But having this kind of mosaic where we have these areas for birds to nest, and then they may be dispersing into the native range with the cows, finding all the insects that the cows are promoting through their grazing out on the landscape. When the young birds start brooding and need that high protein to grow and start thriving themselves. This other program, which is relatively new, is called CRP Grasslands. It's currently what I've been burning midnight oil to work on lately, because we have a big deadline coming up for this. But it's a relatively new program, and 3.1 million acres were approved just this year in the United States, and 642,000 of those acres are in Colorado. So we have a ton of acres going into this program. So this is a working land program that incentivizes landowners to conservatively graze native grasslands. So these farmers and ranchers are getting a base payment to follow a grazing plan that is going to have them more. In some cases, it's doing what they're doing already because they're already being very conservative with their grazing. In some cases, it's stocking down a little bit and having a more conservative rotational based grazing system, and it's kind of helping push them to do that. So these contracts are like 10 to 15 years long, and one thing that's great about these contracts is they don't allow for any sort of development. So they're not easements, but they're kind of an easement light where somebody might sign up in here for 15 years and they're getting paid to graze conservatively. They can't bust ground on a new condo or a new development, and it's promoting good habitat. It's promoting the working lands, which is feeding America, and it is promoting keeping our grasslands intact. So graze fields using a conservation plan provide excellent habitat for birds, beef for consumers, and just healthy ecosystems with their carbon storage, their whole retention of water on the landscape. And this one of my favorite quotes is, "What's good for the herd is good for the bird." Sometimes that's what's good for the bird is good for the herd. It depends on who you're talking to, but a lot of times, if you're doing good by your cows, you're doing good for the birds as well, and you're providing good, strong habitat. So this photo in the upper right was just from the other day out on a Grasslands contract out in Los Animas County, and they have gotten a heck of a lot of water lately, and the grass and everything out there is looking incredible. This is what we call a shaly plain site. So it's very shallow soil. So we don't really have a lot of tall grass in this area. So this is actually pretty healthy for what this site is and what this site is supposed to look like. And the grass down there, I'm seeing some grasses that I usually only see up to my ankle growing up past my knee. Like I know of a rancher down there that's gotten 7 inches in the last 6 weeks and of rain, and the grass are just like little straws. They're sucking that up and they're just shooting up, and they're growing great forage for the cattle and great cover for the birds right now. So some of the other ways that our private lands biologists support conservation. We do outreach, such as presentations like this. Recently, I hosted a ranching for profit workshop, which was co-sponsored by the Audubon Grazing, and we talked to some local, or we had a Dallas Mount, who's a grazing consultant, come in and talk about different ways to graze that is going to be providing good habitat, promoting good soil, and at the end of the day, trying to make the farm and ranch more profitable. So it's kind of checking all the boxes. It's, providing that monetary incentive for some of these landowners to graze in a way that it's actually going to promote that bird habitat and those ecological benefits, but it's also going to bring more profit into their business. So I had a great experience with that. We had a lot of fun. We went out in the field and talked grass, and everybody I talked to had a great time there and learned a lot. And we're going to attempt to try some of the things learned there back at their own ranch. So another thing we do are biological surveys. So this is something we do a lot of, but lately, the last few years, I've been helping Parks and Wildlife with some of their raptor nest surveys. So they have some points where they have historic bald eagle nests. I was going out monitoring whether it was a occupied or unoccupied nest, whether they were fledging out, whether it was successful, kind of just general going out there and getting some field observations once every couple of weeks and kind of tracking how that nest was kind of going along. I also helped out with a prairie dog mapping. We went out to actually into Prowers County, and we mapped some of these prairie dog towns to get an idea of how many acres of prairie dog habitat were on this ranch, and whether there'd be enough acres there to warrant release of some black-footed ferrets from the rearing center there in Fort Collins. And I actually heard it came back that they were going to release some ferrets there this fall, which is pretty exciting. Bird Conservancy has their integrated bird monitoring. So that's where our field technicians go out and they do point counts on private lands, federal lands, throughout, differing habitats just throughout the Rocky Mountains. And a lot of this is off the highway, kind of deep in the woods type surveys. A lot of our parks and wildlife and different agencies do quite a bit of bird monitoring for, pheasants, quail, certain species, but a lot of it's really done by the road because they don't have the manpower to go out and do it. So it's pretty awesome that Bird Conservancy has these technicians that are throwing a backpack on and going miles into the backcountry and getting some data of, rosy finches and some of these other species that are hard to get counts. And that data is used just universally kind of throughout different wildlife agencies. In the bottom right here, I have a picture from our banding station at Chico Basin Ranch. We banded quite a few birds this year. I went out there for 3 different days and helped pull some. I got to do I'm not the band. I mean, I'm sure as many of you know, the banding community is a very hard one to get into. And I am a huge bird safety and health person. So I didn't do a whole lot of actual bird banding or retrieval from our mist nets. I kind of let the trained professionals do that, but I helped quite a bit with the data recording and talking to a lot of the folks that came out to kind of explain what was going on, what was the reason we were doing what we were doing. And we had just some great banders there this year and some great birders come through that know much more about birds than myself and are really very, very knowledgeable folks out at the Chico Basin there. We also partner with other organizations such as Audubon, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service. Just the list can kind of go on and on with that. Different land trusts where we're either helping them with projects, helping to be ambassadors for these wildlife, and just kind of spreading outreach and awareness. So I also like to say that I'm just an ambassador for wildlife, habitat, and farmers and ranchers. So if I'm wearing my Bird Conservancy hat and somebody asks me a question, I'm more than willing to answer questions and, try to explain, what's good for the herd is good for the bird. And, just that, wildlife are in peril and we need to be taking steps to kind of help them. So ways that people can help promote bird conservation. So I'm sure you all know about some of these, but just supporting beef and local beef and ranchers of the plains. They are the ones that are actively managing our prairie. Supporting and joining local working groups, nonprofits, land trusts, conservation districts, education programs, Audubon Society. Just spreading outreach and awareness is one of the best things you can do. I'm a big proponent on purchasing duck stamps and junior duck stamps. Even if you're not a hunter, the duck stamp can get you access to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife properties, though some of the national refuges. Actually, your duck stamp is a ticket to get you in there. So there is overarching. There are benefits to buying it other than just duck hunting, and most, I think it's 98% of the revenue that comes in on the duck stamp goes towards easements and wetlands. So it's just a great way to kind of invest in birds, because not only, ducks are using much of those wetlands, but many birds are using those wetlands, and protecting those is creating lots of flyover habitat and different migration habitat. Monitoring local bird populations through citizen science programs, Christmas bird counts, eBird. Just more data we have about birds, the better. I'm not one that's sifting through data these days, but those that do, the more data, the bigger the data set, the better they can have correlations. It's just the more data, the better. Supporting businesses that support local communities on the plains, and then just volunteering at events that support these communities. So I have a slide here for questions. I can also talk about prairie chickens a little later, but we'll see how we're doing for time. But if anybody has some questions, I'm willing to answer them.
Got a whole list of them here. Trent, hi.
Got a whole list of them.
Peg is
Should I
here.
get out of my PowerPoint here for a second to read them, or are you going to read them too?
No, I'll just read them to you.
Okay.
You mentioned stock tanks. Do they have the stock tanks fitted with ladders these days to prevent bird drownings?
Yeah, anything that are Bird Conservancy or NRCS, most of all the USDA program. I mean, I don't know all the USDA programs, but all of our what we call our standards and specifications. So kind of we'll go out there and measure certain things and do things. It's all a requirement that bird ladders are included on those tanks, whether they're bought or fabricated by the landowner.
Great, good deal. All right, and then you said you partnered with Audubon. Do you partner with them, the conservation ranching program that they have, or?
I do. I've worked with Dallas May a little bit in the past. I had an interested landowner who I am still kind of working my way into getting him to kind of take that leap to kind of get in there. But I have a really good positive working relationship with that rancher, and I've been in contact with him, hoping to. He's got a pretty large property, so getting that all signed up would be great. So it's kind of slow, but it'd be great to kind of get that in there.
You're doing such great work. Just listening to overall things that you're doing, it gives me hope, because I worry about the grassland birds. So it gives me hope. How do you think wind and solar farms are going to affect the grassland birds?
So yeah, wind development seems. I mean, I've heard from other, people in this field who work for consulting companies or just technicians that have had full-time jobs just recording mortality underneath some of these wind farms, and I mean, where the cost. I mean, this is in a bird conservancy policy, so this is kind of me personally. I don't really. These are kind of things that Bird Conservancy likes to have their stance. So sure. I guess taking off the Bird Conservancy hat right now, I think at least with wind, it's just hard on where's the cost benefit of we're not pumping out all that CO2 if we were to be getting that energy from coal, but it's also just detrimental to birds, especially through some of these migration areas. So I kind of struggle a little bit there. I'm a pretty big fan of solar. I know that there's still some, a lot that needs to kind of be worked out in there. But one thing that I would really like to see more with solar is adaptations for integrating grazing or some sort of management within there, just so we do have like spacing them further apart, so it's just not completely shaded and all of a sudden everything underneath is dying, and then we're having a barren wasteland with those panels there. So if we were to have spacing of 20 feet apart or something, and then be able to graze underneath there, or be able to kind of promote some of the habitat in there, I think there are ways that we can make solar work for the birds and grasslands a little easier than we can make wind development work for birds and grasslands.
Yeah, siting those wind farms is really important, isn't it? Making sure it's sited appropriately so we don't have all these birds and bats and dying like crazy.
Yeah.
How are the numbers of ferruginous hawks doing these days? They were a species of concern, I think, with the CPW.
Yeah, they are on our SWAP, our State Wildlife Action Plan. They are one of the species on there. Mm-hmm. I would have to ask one of our technicians on the science team. Just as a arm out the side of the truck as I'm driving around and spending time out on the grasslands, I see quite a bit of ferruginous hawks. So
okay.
I think but I also, my baseline is I moved to Colorado in 2017 and started working here. So my baseline isn't definitely not as far back as other folks. I definitely see quite a bit more red-tailed hawks than I do ferruginous. So it would be nice to, right now my motto is every bird of prey that I see is a red-tailed hawk until proven otherwise. So if I can get my binoculars out, or if I can see some of the plumage and I can say that was a ferruginous hawk, I will call it a ferruginous hawk. But most of the time, I just expect it to be the red tails. Not like red tails are bad species, but it would be cool to see more of those ferruginous hawks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then quickly, what are the native grasses in Colorado?
So we have quite a bit. We have many grasses. I'll just think of some that I saw out there today. Blue grama is it's the state grass of Colorado. It's very sought after by ranchers just because it's very productive as far as grazing goes, and it provides, I wouldn't say amazing bird habitat, but it definitely provides bird habitat. We got side oats grama, which is found usually a little further east, and that kind of side oats grama is kind of an interesting grass. We have these what we call bunch grasses and sod grasses. So you have grasses that kind of grow in these like straight kind of clumps and bunches, and we have the kind of sod grasses that grow kind of like turf. And the side oats is usually a bunch grass, but through overgrazing and certain things, it can actually become sod forming. So it's kind of an interesting grass. Guyetta grass is very similar to kind of side oats. It even looks similar, but that's one of our species. We got little and big blue stem, sand love grass, Indian rice grass, which might be one of my favorite grasses, because it has great structure and is very pretty. But there's quite a few of them out there.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Trent. I just wanted to mention Jorge says in the comments, awesome presentation. Thank you. So
thank you, Jorge.
Yeah. And then I had a question about, let's say that the farmers want to turn that pasture land into native vegetation areas. What would they do if it were just grazed like crazy to decimating like nothing? How would they build that native vegetation back up? Would the farmer be doing that work, or would they get outside help, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's something that the Natural Resources Conservation Service can definitely help with. I've been on a couple of projects where we've done these native seedings. I'd say one of the big things is kind of switching over to some more adaptive cattle management. And if that field's been hit really hard, a lot of times it is just pull the cattle off, give it some years to rest. One thing with seeding is if you do have remnants of grass out there, it's actually really hard to you can still drill grass into the ground, but quite a few folks will do with broadcast seeding, which is kind of just scattering seed on the top. And after something like that, you actually do want the cattle to move through there, and with their hoofs, it actually helps push some of that in the ground. So it kind of depends on the strategy you want to use, but big thing is starting to rest it and working in some new cattle management.
Neat. So that's like a 5-year project, or like a decade project, or how long would something like that take?
So the big thing is our variable water conditions in the Eastern Plains. As we were talking about, this monsoon moisture has been crazy out here lately. Like I got my truck stuck today, actually. Like we're just getting a ton of moisture. So some of these years that we've had in the past few have not had that moisture. So a lot of times you're putting that seed in the ground, and we go through a couple of years of drought, and that seed is becoming unviable. Then you're setting yourself back a couple of years. Or you could seed it in there, and we get a perfect moisture here, and 2 years later, it's actually starting to really come back. So it's really hard to tell. It's just kind of it's really a dice roll with the moisture gradient that we're getting that year.
Awesome, thank you. Peg, do you have any more questions? We don't have any in the comments here.
How about you were going to say something about the lesser prairie chicken? I'd be interested in. I'm sure our audience would be interested in hearing about that too.
Yeah, so I added a question slide here, but then I added some other slides to see what we were doing for time. So here's our, if you'd like to join our flock or donate, there's some of our information. But so if we have time, lesser prairie chickens. So prior to my time with BCR, or Bird Conservancy, I spent almost 3 years working on a lesser prairie chicken project with Parks and Wildlife. So we trapped some birds in kind of central Kansas, and we brought them. This was a huge joint effort. We brought them to the Comanche and Cimarron National Grasslands, and we released them. So we are bringing these birds. I have the picture in a few slides from now, but from what they call the shortgrass CRP eco-region. There are 4 different eco-regions for the lesser prairie chicken. Where southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas is the sand sagebrush eco region. There's that shortgrass prairie eco region in central Kansas. There's mixed grass prairie in Texas, southeast Kansas, and Oklahoma. And then in New Mexico, they have the Shinnery Oak eco region. So we did establish a few leks in Colorado, but these birds, we pulled them off of much of the CRP and the shortgrass. We brought them down to the sagebrush, hoping they would be using all this national grassland sagebrush. But many of them were using their natal habitat selection. So where they were born and raised, they were used to the CRP. And a lot of them flocked out and started making up residence in the CRP down there in Baca County and Cimarron County, Kansas. So here's a picture of a prairie chicken displaying on a lek. So behavior at the lek, leks are flat locations, usually slightly higher. As you can see, there's some bare spots, and it's where the prairie chickens come to mate every spring. So these lek locations are incredible because they'll pass down generation after generation of prairie chickens, and have been recorded in like the same GPS point or the same patch of grass for literally decades. Like, it's incredible. These birds are coming back to the same spot. So the males display for the hens. So you can see this is a perfect picture I took of a prairie chicken. He's got his pinnae flared, which are kind of his 2 big horns that they pop up. He's got his air sacs inflated. His his tail fan is open, and they actually stomp their feet down as they're making these weird, they're just kind of these bizarre booming noises. And you can actually hear their little feet stomping from 20 yards away in a blind. Like, it's pretty incredible. Hens are known to kind of visit multiple of these leks before actually mating. So they shop around and find the guy they really like before they actually settle down with one of them.
Smart girls.
Yep. They get to be very selective, and everybody's showing off what they got. So
that's right.
So
do they still have the lek tours? Forget out near Hawley on private land. There's a lek there. There used to be some tours. Is that still going on? Do you know?
I know that. I don't think it's done at a big scale anymore. I knew that at the Snow Goose Festival, they did auction or had a silent auction for a guided tour on one of those. But most of those are on private lands, and I think with their dire conservation need, that they're kind of keeping those kind of a secret. But sure. in Scott City, Kansas, there's a landowner named Stacy Hamey, and he partners with Kansas Wildlife Parks and Tourism there, and they actually do tours out on his place where he has a bunch of old cattle trailers and things that he's converted into blinds for people to sit out. And he's got a couple hundred prairie chickens and lek on his property, and about 8 or 9 different leks. So it's a really spectacle out there, and he allows people to come out there. So that's a great way. That's where we camped out when we did all this, was Scott Lake State Park. And it's near Scott City, and it's a beautiful area, and it's a great reason to go out there is to go and see his place. So I'm not sure how the whole process on there, but I'm sure if you looked on the Kansas Department of Wildlife or search Scott City, Kansas prairie chicken tours, you'd be able to find there. So,
great.
Here's a picture I took of a hen. She's on the left looking at about 4 males. We're all just doing their darndest to impress her. These are some of the traps we had set up. So these weren't very scientific traps. They're just kind of these chicken wire funnels that went into a trap, and they kind of go in, and it was hard to get out, and we'd run out there and just kind of grab them. So I do have a video here. It's more for the noise of a lesser prairie chicken, so I'm going to try to play it. And if it doesn't go through, and you might have to turn your volume up, but if it's not working, I'll just move on. But we'll see if we can't make it work. Can you all hear it?
Can't hear the booming, no.
Okay. I'll just move on. It's pretty faint, like it's really loud in the blind, but it's hard to capture that on the cell phone. But
yeah,
they're really going at it that day. So here's the map that I was talking about earlier, where you can see the sand sagebrush in Colorado and Kansas. The shortgrass prairie was the green where we were trapping. The mixed grass prairie, that's kind of that Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and then the shinnery oak in the brown down there in New Mexico and into Texas. So partners, landowners, and NRCS are all working towards conservation. So the big thing is keeping grass in grass. I included this chart. I don't know who made this one. I got it sent to me a while back, and I saved it in my drive, and I've been trying to find who I need to give kind of some credit to, but it's kind of showing the land use conversion, which is plowing out acres, and the tree expansion, which is that red cedar encroachment. And they're both really driving grassland habitat loss. So the NRCS really is, and Bird Conservancy is actually hiring a position just like myself in Southwest Nebraska to solely focus on that tree expansion. So the big thing right now is just, keeping the grass in the grass. I kind of talked with the experiences with the sagebrush and the natal habitat, but I've had some experiences with cattle in the landscape, and they've all, with prairie chickens, and they've all been very positive. We had a bird nest within, 100 feet of a stock tank, which is going to be one of your most highly trafficked areas by the cattle. And that bird never got, it might have gotten moved off the nest a time or two, but it incubated there. It did not get stepped on. It nest never got destroyed. It actually never bred, so it never actually hatched out. So it was sitting on some dud eggs, but it sat there for like 45 days, and the cattle never really did anything bad. She just we thought maybe she mated before we took her out of Kansas, and she bombed really far west and then just kind of did her own thing. But I've had some good experiences with cattle and chickens kind of sharing that landscape. And I like to kind of emphasize with this is, conservation does not mean land control or seizure. We want to work with these landowners to promote that habitat, but we don't want to buy up all their land. We don't want to steal their land. There is a little bit of, there may be restrictions now that the bird is, being listed. So, I mean, so there might be some restrictions in the future, and that can be very scary to landowners. So it was always very important to me to mitigate that. We're not trying to grab land. We just want to work with you to find out what's best for these birds. And CRP is just integral to saving these birds. The CRP program has produced like that. Shortgrass prairie region in Kansas is just full of CRP, and that's our strongest hold for these lesser prairie chickens. That's why we're able to trap some and bring it back. Up on the upper right here where this pole is, that was where that prairie chicken nested in the CRP, and you can just see that there's probably 2 more of those kind of dark areas below there, kind of those stripes. So that bird was just really hidden underneath there and had a great little nest out in that CRP. So it just provides thick cover and it provides these habitat. And CRP loss is happening through lower payment rates from the program and the really high commodity prices. So I do see I'm getting a little over time. I don't know if I should stop or if I should just keep going. It's kind of up to you guys.
I'm interested. Do you have a deadline, Aaron? Do you need to quit?
No, we're good. You can keep on going.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if I'm interested and people want to keep hearing me talking, I'll keep talking. So this CRP let's see. Okay. So I'm almost done. So the CRP loss is happening through the low payment rates and high commodity prices. So some of these folks are seeing that, what's going on in the world. Wheat prices have shot up, corn prices have shot up, soybean prices are high, and it's pretty attractive for some of these folks to say, hey, the CRP isn't paying what it used to. Maybe I'll take a chisel out there, turn this back over, and plant some row crops. So there is some loss to the CRP going on, and that's a big part of why Bird Conservancy has me on as a quote-unquote CRP specialist, is try to retain this. So I'm currently working with some grant funding dollars to provide boundary fences along these CRPs to help promote keeping that into a grazing system. So we're gonna kind of have a 10-year agreement with some of these landowners that they're not going to turn it over. We're helping provide some of that, relieving some of that cost burden of putting a fence around these parcels, and the NRCS program can then come through and help pay for the water development and those interior fencing. But the NRCS, because of legal issues with boundaries, will not actually pay for any boundary fence. So right now, if you were to contract it with paying for labor, it's almost $10,000 a mile to do putting in fence. So if you have a 640 acre section where it's got a mile on each section, it's $40,000 to fence that before, and then you don't even have the water on it. So a lot of these landowners are looking, it could be easier for me to just turn it over. So us a Bird Conservancy with this grant funding are really focusing on helping relieve some of that burden and really starting to kind of try to promote that keeping of the CRP, especially in some of these areas where we have some critical habitats. So I'm really happy that we're moving forward with that. And I've been very happy with my position of being able to kind of work with this program that's just providing great benefits for prairie chickens. So one thing that I've seen with these birds, I don't know how much of this is scientifically, like in the books or documented and peer reviewed, but just as a person who's spent a lot of time with telemetry equipment tracking birds, is what I see a lot is the prairie chickens love to nest in the CRP. They love that thick cover, and they would nest in there. And when they would hatch out, it was amazing the march that mama would make those little brood do. And a lot of times they would beeline for the closest grazed field. Like I said, this isn't backed up. This is just anecdotal what I've seen. So when I've seen them go over there, I mean, I haven't seen these papers written about that, so I don't know exactly why, but I think it's a little easier to maneuver chicks that can't fly yet through shorter habitat that's being grazed. A lot of times where it's being grazed, you're seeing a lot of grasshoppers and insects and more forb and pollinators and different insects. So, and that's just that high protein content for those young birds is one reason why I think they kind of like to go into that range. And during the winter, I would actually find a lot of birds around crop fields like milo, sorghum, corn. Like they wouldn't be actively sitting in the middle of the plowed out field all day long, but I think they were kind of using the CRP and rangeland around, going in there, feeding on some of that spilled harvest and having some of that like kind of really high, valuable, nutritious food source that we weren't able to capture it all. So I think that was kind of one of my rationales for them using that. So going back to kind of what I was talking about, the mosaic is you kind of need that overarching, like especially with the prairie chickens, I was seeing them use the CRP, rangeland that had been grazed really hard, rangeland that hadn't been grazed very hard, actively cropped fields. Like I've seen them use quite a bit of different types of habitat. But one thing that was kind of overarching is there were large tracts of connected grassland habitat. So there might be a crop field in there, here and there, but it wasn't just crop circle after crop circle after crop circle and lots of prairie chicken use. It was half a crop circle down the road. The prairie chickens might fly over there and feed, and then kind of go back to their CRP or their range to kind of roost and spend the night. So like I said, this is all anecdotal. My theories from just spending time driving around, spinning around in circles with the telemetry equipment and finding them every day in certain areas and kind of picking up on their patterns.
Interesting. So, very interesting.
Well, I'll go back to my second question slide if anybody has questions or wants to pick my brain on lesser prairie chickens.
I understand that prairie chickens don't like overhead transmission lines. They shy away from that sort of thing. Have you seen that to be true?
Where I was tracking these birds in Prowers County, I did not run across a lot of overhead. I mean, I ran across a few where they were pretty close to, small telephone poles with just two wires going across, but not like the large transmission. Yeah. Okay. But there isn't a lot of large transmission lines that go through that country, so I can't say for sure. But it is something that, I know there's research out there that if there's a tree on the landscape, the birds almost have a buffer of a quarter mile around that, if not even further, where they're not using that habitat because there's a tree there. So kind of based on that, I would think if you have 50, 60 foot tall transmission lines going through, like the real big ones, it would be a pretty big deterrent for those birds.
Sure. That XL power pathway is going to head through southeastern Colorado. I just wondered if it was, will it impact prairie chicken habitat? I'm not sure of the exact path for that. Have you heard of that?
I have heard about that. It was going from Boone, I think east to like Holly.
Pardon me?
And then, was it going from like Boone, Colorado, east to like Holly and then back north?
Yeah, and then near Chico Basin too. Chico Basin,
near
right?
Chico, yeah.
So yeah,
I could definitely see there being negative impacts on the prairie chickens if there are some things close to there. I'd have to look at the distribution of prairie chickens known in Colorado compared to there to say if it's going to have a direct impact, but there's definitely that would be running something that would deter prairie chickens through critical prairie chicken habitat. But again, I don't know where Bird Conservancy stands on that. So that's coming from Trent DElahenty, the biologist, and not the Bird Conservancy employee. So we have to kind of insulate from some of these kind of hot button issues sometimes, or we have like official statements. So I kind of want to say that might not be exactly the way Bird Conservancy feels. So that's the way I just feel.
This has been great. Thank you so much. Aaron, did you have anything for him?
Yeah, no, I can't. I can't think of anything. I think that if you were a landowner wanting to enroll or be a part of this program, what would be the best way to do that? And then also, if you were just a conservation enthusiast, aside from buying the duck stamps and things like that, what would be the best way to contact you all?
So, yeah, I mostly work with the private landowners, but my email's there. I'd recommend if anybody is interested in any of these programs, go into your local NRCS office. We have one in nearly every county, not every single county, but nearly every county. There's a NRCS office. There's one in Walsenburg, Trinidad, Rocky Ford, Pueblo, Springs, Flagler. They're all over the place. So just go in there and talk to a conservationist, and they can kind of get you going on the different programs we offer. If you want to get involved with Bird Conservancy, Facebook, Instagram, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, we have a website. They have a lot of different ways they can get involved. We have a lot of citizen science going on. We have our banding stations, which are open to the public. If you're ever interested in going out and watching some bird banding, we have Chico Basin, I think, is in the spring only, and then Bar Lake State Park, I think, is fall only. I'm not exactly sure. And then I think Ridgeway, we have a station that's open year round. So
Awesome.
Those are great ways to get involved. And yeah, our education team has quite a bit of outreach events and stuff they put on, but we got plenty of partners. Like I know, like the Yampa Valley Crane Festival up in Steamboat's going on soon. I think we're gonna have some presence there, and we have quite a bit of partners and just outreach events that we post on there that be a great way to kind of get involved with the community, or even just buy an admission ticket that's going towards crane conservation or something along those lines. So
great, thanks very much, and thank you, Peg, and I appreciate your time, and this is illuminating. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and,
Trent and Aaron.
Well, thank you guys.
Yeah.
And this will be on the Rawlings Library Facebook page and YouTube channel. And so there may not be a lot of participants now, but believe me, there'll be hundreds who watch it at their leisure. So you will get an audience that hears your message.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that people like to hear me ramble about birds and grass. So
I don't think you rambled. I think you were pretty darn good, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I appreciate you guys giving me a platform, and I appreciate everything you guys do as far as promoting birding in the Arkansas Valley. I think we got a really special. It's just really special that just the wide variety of birds and different species of wildlife and that you can find in this area. So it's pretty incredible. So I'm happy that you guys are out there getting more people out in the field and getting them knowledgeable about these habitats, birds, and plants. So it's great.
All right. Thank you both.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much.